When a successful lawyer, Daniel Pierce, is asked to help a troubled 12-year-old boy, Tyler, his perfectly controlled life takes an unexpected turn. What starts as a reluctant responsibility soon becomes a transformative journey for both of them. As Daniel gets closer to Tyler, he's forced to confront his own emotional barriers, while Tyler must learn to trust again after years of abandonment. Will they heal together or fall apart under the weight of their pasts? Watch as these two unlikely characters form an unbreakable bond, discovering what truly matters in life. Subscribe and hit the bell to follow their journey and share your thoughts in the comment. Show would you handle a life-changing responsibility like this? Daniel Pierce stood at the window of his luxurious 50th floor office, looking out at the towering skyline of downtown Chicago. The view stretched out endlessly before him, urban jungle of glass and steel, shimmering under the early morning light. Daniel didn't often take time to admire the city he had spent years conquering. For him, the view was a constant reminder of his success, his ability to rise above the ordinary masses below. Every building, every street, every landmark was a symbol of his power and influence in this competitive metropolis. At 43 years old, Daniel had everything he thought he wanted: prestige, wealth, and an impeccable reputation as one of the top attorneys in Chicago. He had built his career from the ground up with nothing but sheer determination, a sharp intellect, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. His name, mentioned in legal circles, commanded respect. People knew him as a man who never lost a case, a man who could outmaneuver his opponents with a cold, calculated precision that bordered on ruthless. His clients weren't average citizens. They were titans of industry, corporate executives, politicians, people whose decisions affected thousands of lives. These clients didn't just hire Daniel for his legal expertise. They hired him for his unyielding focus, his ability to bend the system to his will. They trusted him to handle the most complex, high-stakes cases because they knew that Daniel Pierce didn't just win cases. He obliterated the opposition. He had become famous for his icy demeanor in the courtroom. His cross-examinations were legendary, dissecting witnesses with surgical precision. He found cracks in the most airtight of testimonies, tearing apart the defense until there was nothing left. His reputation wasn't just built on victories, but on how thoroughly he demolished his opponents. Once Daniel took on a case, the opposition had no room to breathe. He left no stone unturned, no loophole unexploited. Still standing at the window, Daniel's gaze flickered to his reflection. His dark hair was neatly combed, his suit a perfectly tailored masterpiece in navy blue, with a crisp white shirt and a burgundy tie. His eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. The clean lines of his jaw and the steely set of his mouth gave him an aura of confidence that matched his meticulously controlled life. Everything about Daniel, from the way he dressed to the way he worked, was a reflection of his obsession with perfection. Behind him, his office spoke volumes about who he was. Minimalist in design, yet exuding an understated luxury, it mirrored the way he lived, efficient, sleek, and devoid of unnecessary emotion. Every piece of furniture was hand-picked modern, angular, and without any frills. The walls were adorned with expensive art, each piece selected for its ability to inspire focus and drive. He liked to think that the room itself was an extension of his mind, ordered, composed, and impenetrable. Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 7:45 a.m., and already his day had been planned down to the minute. His assistant, Julia Reeves, would arrive soon to remind him of his first meeting, a high-stakes negotiation with one of the largest conglomerates in the Midwest. It was just another step toward further solidifying his reputation as the go-to lawyer for the city's elite. His days always followed the same precise rhythm: up at 500 a.m. for a workout in his private gym, pushing his body through a grueling routine that left him feeling invincible. Then a cold shower that shocked his senses awake, preparing him for the challenges ahead. Breakfast, meticulously prepared by his personal chef, consisted of a carefully balanced combination of nutrients, designed to fuel his mind and body for the day's battles. By the time he left his penthouse apartment, just before sunrise, Daniel had already been awake for hours, primed for the day ahead. There were no distractions in Daniel's world. No family waiting at home, no romantic entanglements, no messy emotions. He had long ago decided that personal relationships were a liability, something that only got in the way of success. In his experience, they were an unnecessary complication, one that could derail even the most disciplined of men. Daniel had seen it happen to others' colleagues who had once been brilliant, but who had let love or family pull them off course. He wasn't going to make the same mistake. As his thoughts drifted, the intercom on his desk buzzed softly. Julia's voice, calm and efficient, came through the speaker. "Mr. Pierce, your 800A. Meh. Meeting with Mr. Walsh has been moved up. He'll be here in 15 minutes. Daniel frowned slightly. Richard Walsh, one of his most prominent clients, was always punctual. Moving a meeting up by an hour was unlike him. Daniel pushed aside the thought, dismissing it as unimportant. He had worked with Richard for years, handling everything from corporate mergers to personal legal matters, and he knew the man well enough to understand that any change in schedule was likely significant. "Understood," Daniel said, his voice cool as ever. "Send him up when he arrives." He turned back to his desk, but his mind lingered on Richard. There had been something odd in their last few interactions, something Daniel couldn't quite put his finger on. Richard, a billionaire businessman with deep ties to Chicago's political elite, had always been steady, self-assured. Lately, though, he seemed distracted, troubled even. It was a subtle change, but Daniel's instincts had picked up on it nonetheless. Richard Walsh wasn't just a client, he was one of the most influential men in the city. His family's name carried weight, their legacy stretching back over a century. They were old money, the kind of wealth that wasn't flaunted but was simply understood. Richard's mother had been a philanthropist, his father a ruthless businessman. He had inherited both traits, generous when it suited him, but utterly unflinching in matters of business. Daniel often admired Richard's ability to balance both sides of his life. He was a man who could navigate charity galas with as much ease as boardroom battles. But whatever had been weighing on him lately was different, and Daniel, though rarely concerned with the personal affairs of his clients, couldn't help but wonder what had changed. Daniel sat behind his desk, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping on the surface as he waited for Richard to arrive. His mind wandered back to the world outside the walls of his office. The bustling city, the relentless pace of life below, people rushing to jobs that wouldn't bring them the kind of power or influence Daniel wielded effortlessly. He was far removed from that world, insulated by his success, his wealth, his carefully constructed life. The door to his office opened softly, and Julia entered, her usual calm expression in place. Julia had worked for Daniel for nearly a decade. She was everything he expected in an assistant professional, competent, and unfailingly discreet. She was one of the few people who understood the demands of Daniel's world, but even with Julia, Daniel kept his distance. "Mr. Walsh is here," she announced, stepping aside to allow Richard to enter. Richard Walsh cut an imposing figure, even in his early 60s. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair that had once been a deep brown, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. But today, as he walked into Daniel's office, there was a noticeable heaviness in his steps, a weariness that seemed out of place for a man of his stature. "Richard," Daniel greeted him, standing and offering a handshake. "I wasn't expecting you so early." Richard accepted the handshake but didn't immediately sit down. Instead, he stood by the window, staring out at the city with a far-off look in his eyes. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them growing heavier by the second. Finally, Richard let out a sigh and turned to face Daniel. "I need your help with something. Personal," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Daniel raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for Richard to continue. It was rare for his clients, especially someone like Richard, to bring personal matters to his attention. Daniel's role had always been professional, detached. He handled the legalities, the corporate deals, the crises that could be solved with paperwork and courtroom battles. Personal issues were not his domain. Richard sat down heavily in the chair across from Daniel's desk, rubbing his temples as if trying to ease the tension in his head. "It's about my nephew, Tyler." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. He knew Richard had family, of course, but he had never heard him mention a nephew before. "Go on," Daniel said, keeping his tone neutral. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "My sister. She passed away a few years ago. Tyler's her son. After she died, he was placed in foster care. My wife and I tried to get him back, but, well, the system doesn't always work the way it should." Daniel's mind raced, trying to process the information. Richard Walsh, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the city, had a nephew in foster care. It didn't make sense. How could someone with Richard's resources not have control over a situation like this? "He was placed with a few different families," Richard continued, his voice heavy with regret. "But none of them worked out. He's been bouncing around the system for years now. And recently, I found out that he's back in the city. But he's not in a foster home anymore. He's been living on the streets." The weight of Richard's words settled over the room, filling the space between them. Daniel felt a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or maybe guilt. He wasn't sure. But the image of a child Richard's nephew alone on the streets of Chicago was hard to ignore. "I've tried to find him," Richard said, his voice growing more desperate. "I've had people searching, but he's been slipping through the cracks. Daniel, I need your help. I need someone I can trust to bring him home." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the request. This wasn't a case he could approach the way he handled his corporate clients. There were no contracts to negotiate, no legal strategies to deploy. This was personal, messy, emotional, and yet Richard was asking him to step into that world, to help him find the boy. "I'll see what I can do," Daniel finally said, keeping his voice steady. He wasn't sure why he was agreeing to this. It wasn't his expertise, and yet something about the urgency in Richard's voice made it impossible to refuse. Richard nodded, his relief palpable. "Thank you, Daniel. You don't know how much this means to me." As Richard left the office, Daniel stared after him, his thoughts a tangled mess. This was not the kind of problem he was used to solving. But as he glanced at the clock and prepared for his next meeting, he couldn't shake the image of the boy Tyler somewhere out there, lost in the city Daniel had spent his life mastering. For the next several days, Daniel's life continued in its usual rhythm. Meetings, negotiations, court appearance. His calendar was as full as ever. But in the back of his mind, Richard's words lingered. He had promised to help, and yet he hadn't taken any real steps to do so. Part of him hoped that Richard's people would find Tyler before Daniel needed to get involved. But the more time passed, the more Daniel felt a strange sense of responsibility creeping in. It wasn't that he was used to ignoring problems. Quite the opposite. Daniel prided himself on his ability to solve them quickly and efficiently. But this was different. This wasn't a problem that could be fixed with a contract or a court order. This was a child's life. And for reasons Daniel couldn't quite explain, that fact weighed heavily on him. By the time the end of the week rolled around, Daniel decided he couldn't wait any longer. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Lance Hargrove, a private investigator he had worked with in the past. If anyone could track down a missing person, it was Lance. "Daniel," Lance's voice greeted him on the other end of the line. "What can I do for you?" "I've got a situation," Daniel said, his voice measured. "I need you to find someone for me. A kid named Tyler Davis. Has the nephew of Richard Walsh." Lance let out a low whistle. "Walsh's nephew, that's big. What's the story?" "He's been in foster care, but now he's on the streets. Walsh has people looking, but they haven't had any luck. I need you to track him down." There was a brief pause on the other end, then Lance's voice came back, serious now. "Consider it done. I'll start digging." After ending the call, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his thoughts still swirling. He wasn't sure what he would do once Lance found the boy. He wasn't a social worker, and he certainly wasn't equipped to handle a child who had been through what Tyler had. But he had made a promise to Richard, and Daniel Pierce wasn't the kind of man who broke promises. Daniel had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to keep his personal and professional lives separate, his emotions at bay, and his focus razor-sharp. But since his meeting with Richard Walsh, something had shifted inside him. The problem of Tyler's disappearance gnawed at the back of his mind, disrupting the perfect order of his days. Even as he sat in meetings or cross-examined witnesses in court, his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy, this 12-year-old kid who was out there somewhere, lost in a world Daniel knew all too well. It wasn't long before Lance Hargrove, the private investigator, reached out to Daniel with the first lead. "I've found something," Lance said over the phone, his voice low and direct. "Tyler's been seen at a shelter downtown St. Anthony's. It's a temporary place for kids in trouble. He's been coming and going for the last few weeks." Daniel felt a flicker of relief at the news, but it was quickly tempered by the reality of what Lance was telling him. Tyler wasn't in foster care or living with a family. He was spending his nights in a shelter, on the edge of homelessness. The thought unsettled Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. "Send me the address," Daniel said, already standing from his desk. He ignored the stack of case files that had been waiting for his attention all morning. "I'm going to see him." Lance hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure that's the best move? I can handle it from here if you want." But Daniel knew that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about solving a problem for a client anymore. This was personal. He had agreed to help, and now that Tyler had been found, he couldn't pass the responsibility on to someone else. "Not this time." "I'll take it from here," Daniel said, his voice firmer than he had intended. "Send me the details." Within minutes, Lance had forwarded the address, and Daniel was on his way to St. Anthony's shelter, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he would say to Tyler or how the boy would react to seeing him again after their first disastrous encounter. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. St. Anthony's shelter was a far cry from the world Daniel usually inhabited. The building was old and worn, its brick facade stained by years of grime. A faded sign hung above the entrance, and as Daniel stepped inside, the smell of disinfectant and old furniture hit him immediately. The small lobby was filled with mismatched chairs, some occupied by tired-looking people waiting for food or a bed. There was a kind of quiet despair in the air, the kind Daniel hadn't experienced firsthand but had heard about in courtrooms and charity events. A volunteer behind the front desk greeted him with a polite but weary smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for a boy," Daniel said, his voice low. "Tyler Davis. I was told he's been staying here." The volunteer's expression softened slightly. "Tyler? Yeah, I've seen him around. He comes in at night sometimes, but he doesn't stay long. Keeps to himself mostly. Let me see if he's here today." She disappeared into the back, leaving Daniel alone in the lobby. As he waited, he took in his surroundings. The shelter was clearly doing its best to help, but it was underfunded and overcrowded. The walls were scuffed, the furniture outdated, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. It was a world away from the polished office Daniel had just left, and the contrast unsettled him more than he expected. A few minutes later, the volunteer returned with a young boy trailing behind her. "Tyler." Daniel's heart clenched at the sight of him. Tyler looked even smaller than he had when they had first met. His clothes were still too big for his thin frame, and his face, so young, yet already worn by the hardships he had faced, was set in a guarded expression. His dark eyes flickered with recognition when they met Daniel's, but there was no warmth in his gaze. Just suspicion. "Tyler," Daniel said, stepping forward but keeping his distance, careful not to crowd him. "Do you remember me?" Tyler's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment he didn't respond. He stood stiffly, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as if he were bracing for something. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low and wary. "I remember." Daniel sighed inwardly. This was going to be easy. He had failed Tyler once, dismissed him without a second thought, and now he had to find a way to undo that damage. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He wasn't used to apologizing, especially not to a child, but it felt necessary. "The last time we met, I should have listened to you. I didn't. And I'm sorry for that." Tyler's expression didn't change. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his body language still defensive. "What do you want?" Daniel hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He hadn't fully thought through what he would say when he found Tyler, and now, faced with the boy's distrust, he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. "I'm here because your Uncle Richard Walsh has been looking for you," Daniel finally said. "He wants to help." At the mention of his uncle, Tyler's expression darkened. His hands tightened into fists at his sides, and his eyes, already full of anger, flashed with something deeper, something like betrayal. "I don't care about him," Tyler said bitterly. "He doesn't care about me." "No one does." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of Tyler's words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life navigating the world of power and influence, where relationships were transactional and emotions were a weakness to be avoided. But this was different. This was a boy who had been abandoned by the very people who should have protected him. And Daniel, in his own way, had been just as guilty of turning a blind eye. "He does care," Daniel said, though he knew it wouldn't be enough to convince Tyler. "He's been trying to find you for years. He didn't know where you were, but now that he does, he wants to make things right." Tyler scoffed, his voice full of bitterness. "It's too late for that." Daniel wanted to argue, to tell Tyler that it was too late, that there were people who cared about him. But he knew that Tyler wasn't ready to hear that not yet. The boy had built walls around himself, walls that had been reinforced by years of disappointment and neglect. And breaking through those walls would take time. But Daniel wasn't going to give up. Not this time. The next few weeks were filled with uncertainty and cautious steps forward. Daniel had managed to convince Tyler to come with him, not to his apartment, but to a small hotel nearby, where Tyler could have a room of his own and some privacy. It was a temporary solution, but it was better than leaving him at the shelter. Tyler, though still distrustful, had agreed to stay, if only because he had nowhere else to go. The boy remained guarded, keeping to himself most of the time, but Daniel made a point to check in on him regularly, offering help without being too pushy. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He had never been responsible for anyone but himself, but he was trying. And for Daniel, that was new territory. One afternoon, after a long day in court, Daniel stopped by the hotel with food. He knocked on Tyler's door, half expecting the boy to ignore him, as he had done a few times before. But this time, Tyler answered, though his expression was still wary. "I brought dinner," Daniel said, holding up the takeout bags. "Thought you might be hungry." Tyler glanced at the bags, then back at Daniel. For a moment, it looked like he was going to refuse, but then he stepped aside, letting Daniel into the room. It wasn't Mucha's small, clean space with a bed and a table, but it was better than the shelter. Tyler sat on the edge of the bed, his hands fidgeting in his lap, as Daniel set the food on the table. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the rustle of wrappers and the soft hum of traffic outside. Daniel wasn't sure how to start a conversation with Tyler. Small talk had never been his strength, and he doubted that Tyler would respond well to it anyway. But after a few minutes, Tyler broke the silence. "You don't have to do this, you know," Tyler said quietly, not looking up from his food. "I don't need anyone to take care of me." Daniel set his fork down, his gaze steady on the boy. "I know you're used to taking care of yourself," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But you don't have to anymore. You're not alone, Tyler." Tyler's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. "I've always been alone." The words cut through Daniel like a knife. He had never truly understood loneliness. He had chosen to be alone, to focus on his career and push away anything that might distract him from success. But Tyler hadn't chosen this life. He had been thrust into it, abandoned by the people who should have loved him. "You don't have to be," Daniel said softly. "Your uncle wants to help." "I want to help." Tyler didn't respond, but his shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time since they had met, Daniel saw a flicker of vulnerability in the boy's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something a crack in the armor that Tyler had built around himself. Daniel knew it would take time, but he was willing to wait. He didn't fully understand why he cared so much about this boy, but he knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. As the days passed, the fragile connection between Daniel and Tyler slowly began to grow. It wasn't easy. Tyler was still wary, still guarded, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Daniel saw a glimmer of trust in the boy's eyes. One afternoon, while they were sitting in the park near the hotel, watching a group of kids play baseball, Tyler spoke up unexpectedly. "I used to play," he said, his voice soft but tinged with sadness. "Before my mom got sick." Daniel turned to him, surprised. It was the first time Tyler had mentioned his mother. "You were good." Tyler shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in his expression. "I guess. My mom always said I had a good arm. We used to play catch in the park all the time." Daniel could hear the pain in Tyler's voice, the loss of something he could never get back. "Do you want to play again?" he asked carefully. "We could throw a ball around sometime if you want." Tyler hesitated, his expression guarded. "I don't know." "I'm serious," Daniel said, his tone light but genuine. "I could use the practice. It's been years since I've played anything." For a moment, Tyler looked like he might say no. But then slowly he nodded. Maybe? It was a small step, but Daniel felt a surge of hope. Tyler was starting to open up, even if it was just a little. And Daniel was determined to be there for him, however long it took. It was late one evening when everything changed. Daniel had just returned to the hotel after a long day at the office. He had brought dinner as usual, but when he knocked on Tyler's door, there was no answer. Concerned, Daniel knocked again, then opened the door slightly, peeking inside. Tyler was sitting on the edge of the bed, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking, and Daniel realized with a start that the boy was crying. "Tyler," Daniel said softly, stepping into the room. He had never seen Tyler like this, so vulnerable, so raw. The boy had always been so guarded, so determined to keep his emotions in check. Seeing him break down like this sent a wave of protectiveness surging through Daniel. Tyler didn't look up. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with tears. "I miss her." Daniel's heart ached. He didn't need to ask who Tyler was talking about. He already knew. "Your mom?" Tyler nodded, his hands still covering his face. "She was all I had," he whispered, "and now she's gone." Daniel sat down beside him, not sure what to say. He wasn't good at this, at comforting, at connecting. But he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. "I'm sorry, Tyler," Daniel said quietly. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." For a long moment, Tyler didn't say anything. He just sat there, his body trembling with silent sobs. Daniel reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. Finally, Tyler spoke again, his voice hoarse from crying. "Why did she have to leave me?" Daniel's throat tightened. He wished he had an answer, something that would take away Tyler's pain, but he didn't. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know that she loved you. And I know she wouldn't want you to go through this alone." Tyler finally looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and confusion. "I don't want to be alone anymore." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life avoiding emotional connections, choosing solitude over vulnerability. But now, faced with a boy who had lost everything, he realized just how wrong he had been. "You're not alone," Daniel said firmly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since they had met, Tyler leaned into Daniel's embrace, allowing himself to be comforted. And in that moment, Daniel knew that everything had changed. The following days were filled with a new sense of purpose for Daniel. He had never been the kind of person to care deeply about others, at least not in the personal sense. But Tyler had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't realized he was missing. He found himself thinking about the boy constantly, whether he was okay, what he was feeling, how he could help. It was an unfamiliar sensation, this responsibility, this need to protect. But it wasn't unwelcome. Tyler, for his part, seemed to be opening up more. The walls he had built around himself were slowly coming down. And though he still had moments of anger and distrust, there were also moments of connection. They spent more time together, talking, playing catch, watching movies, and Daniel found himself enjoying the boy's company more than he had expected. But there was still the matter of Tyler's future. Daniel had been in contact with Richard Walsh, updating him on the situation. But the question of what to do next loomed over them both. Tyler couldn't stay in the hotel forever, and Daniel wasn't sure if Richard was prepared to take the boy in. One evening, after another long day at the office, Daniel sat down with Tyler to talk about what came next. "Your uncle wants to see you," Daniel said gently. He wants to bring you home. Tyler's expression darkened, the walls going back up. I don't care about him. Daniel sighed. He had expected this reaction. I know you're angry with him, and you have every right to be. But he's trying, Tyler. Has trying to make things right. Tyler didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to decide anything right now, but I want you to think about it. Has family? The word family seemed to hang in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. For Daniel, family had never been a priority. But for Tyler, it was everything he had lost. He'll think about it, Tyler finally muttered, though his tone suggested that he wasn't ready to forgive just yet. It wasn't the answer Daniel had hoped for, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks following Tyler's emotional breakdown, things between him and Daniel seemed to be improving, least on the surface. They had established a fragile routine, sharing meals, playing catch in the park, and spending quiet evenings watching baseball or playing card games. But beneath the surface, Daniel could sense that something was still unresolved. Tyler was opening up, but there was a tension, a simmering anger that hadn't fully been addressed. Then one afternoon, everything fell apart. Daniel had returned to his office after a meeting when he received a phone call from Richard Walsh. The call was short, but the tension in Richard's voice was unmistakable. He had arranged a meeting with a social worker and wanted to move forward with taking custody of Tyler. The idea had been brewing for a while, but now it was becoming a reality. After hanging up, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the phone. He had known this moment would come. Tyler couldn't stay with him indefinitely. But the idea of handing him over to Richard didn't sit well. He couldn't deny that Tyler belonged with family, but over the past few weeks, Daniel had begun to feel responsible for the boy in ways he hadn't expected. When Daniel arrived back at the hotel that evening, Tyler was sitting on the bed, playing a game on his phone. His posture was relaxed, but Daniel could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked up to him for a moment before quickly returning to the screen. Tyler could always tell when something was off. We need to talk, Daniel said, keeping his tone calm but direct. Tyler put down his phone, eyeing Daniel warily. What's going on? Daniel sat down in the chair across from him. Your uncle wants to take you in. Has made arrangements with a social worker, and we're going to have a meeting soon. Tyler's expression darkened instantly, the walls going up. I don't care about him. I told you that. I know, Daniel said carefully, trying to stay calm. But he's your family. He's trying to make things right, and I think you should give him a chance. Tyler's hands clenched into fists, his face twisting with anger. You're just like him, he snapped. You don't actually care about me. You just want to get rid of me. The accusation hit Daniel like a slap. That's not true, he said, his voice rising slightly. I've been here for you every day. I'm not trying to get rid of you, Tyler. Tyler stood abruptly, his body shaking with anger. You're lying, he shouted. You're just doing this because of him. Because you owe him or whatever. You don't care about me, you never did. Daniel's heart sank. He knew Tyler's anger wasn't just about Richard. It was about everything, about being abandoned, about losing his mother, about the foster system failing him. But in that moment, Tyler's rage was directed squarely at him. Tyler, listen! No, Tyler yelled, cutting him off. You don't understand. You've never been where I've been. You've never had to live in a shelter or get moved from house to house like you don't matter. You've never lost everything. The words hung in the air, raw and painful. Daniel could feel the weight of them, and he knew Tyler was right. He didn't understand, not fully, not in the way Tyler needed him to. Before Daniel could respond, Tyler grabbed his backpack, stuffed it with clothes, and stormed toward the door. I'm leaving, he muttered, his voice cracking with emotion. Panic surged through Daniel. Tyler, wait, please don't do this. But Tyler didn't stop. He yanked the door open and disappeared into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The moment Tyler left the hotel, Daniel's heart dropped into his stomach. He couldn't let the boy disappear again. Not after all they had been through, not after the progress they had made. Without wasting a second, Daniel grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his mind racing. Tyler could have gone anywhere, but Daniel had a sinking feeling he knew where he'd be heading. St. Anthony's shelter had been the one place Tyler had felt safe before he'd come into Daniel's life. If he was going to run, he'd likely go back there. Daniel's car roared to life as he sped through the city streets, his thoughts jumbled with guilt and fear. He had failed Tyler once again, failed to understand him, failed to see the depth of his pain. And now the boy was out there, lost and alone. When he arrived at St. Anthony's, the building was quiet, the usual activity having died down for the night. Daniel stepped inside and immediately spotted one of the volunteers at the front desk, a woman he recognized from his last visit. "Have you seen Tyler Davis?" Daniel asked, his voice strained with urgency. "He mighty come back here." The woman nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Yeah, Hez here. He came in about an hour ago. Hez in the back, but he's pretty upset." Relief washed over Daniel, but it was quickly followed by a wave of apprehension. He wasn't sure how Tyler would react to seeing him again. But he had to try. He couldn't let this situation spiral any further. Daniel made his way through the dimly lit hallway, his footsteps quiet as he approached the back room where Tyler was. He found the boy sitting on one of the old couches, his knees drawn up to his chest, his face buried in his arms. He looked small, fragile, nothing like the angry, defiant kid who had stormed out just an hour ago. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of how to approach. He had never been good at this, comforting people, dealing with emotions. But as he looked at Tyler curled up on that couch, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had to fix this. He had to be there for him. "Tyler," Daniel said softly, stepping into the room. Tyler didn't look up, but his body tensed. "What do you want?" he muttered, his voice muffled by his arms. "I want to talk," Daniel said, keeping his tone gentle. "Please." There was a long silence before Tyler finally raised his head, his eyes red and swollen from crying. He looked at Daniel with a mixture of hurt and anger. But there was something else there, too, something like confusion, like he didn't know how to feel anymore. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter. But I promise you, you do matter, Tyler. You matter to me." Tyler's lip quivered, and he looked away, his hands gripping the fabric of his jeans tightly. "Why do you even care?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, searching for the right words. He had never been good at expressing his feelings, but this wasn't about him anymore. This was about Tyler. "I care because I've seen what you've been through," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I care because I don't want you to feel like you're alone. I know I can't understand everything you've been through, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Tyler didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor. But then, slowly, he wiped at his eyes and looked up at Daniel with a vulnerability that took him by surprise. "Do you mean that?" Tyler asked, his voice small. Daniel nodded. "I do." There was another long pause before Tyler finally spoke again. "I don't want to go back with him. I don't want to go with my uncle." Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't about Richard, it was about Tyler trusting him. And in that moment, Daniel knew what he had to do. "You don't have to," Daniel said softly. "You can stay with me." The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and logistics. After Tyler's decision to stay with Daniel, there was still the matter of making it official. Daniel had been in touch with Richard Walsh, explaining Tyler's feelings and the situation. Surprisingly, Richard had been more understanding than Daniel had expected. "I just want what's best for him," Richard had said over the phone. "If staying with you is what he wants, then I'll support it." But even with Richard's blessing, there were legal hurdles to overcome. Daniel had never considered himself the fatherly type, but as he navigated the process of becoming Tyler's legal guardian, he realized that this was something he wanted, something he had never imagined wanting, but now couldn't imagine his life without. Julia, his assistant, helped him with the paperwork, and over the course of several weeks, the guardianship was finalized. Tyler, once lost in the foster system, now had a home, a real home, with someone who cared about him. The day the guardianship was made official, Daniel and Tyler sat in the office of the family court, waiting for the final signatures to be filed. Tyler was unusually quiet, his hands fidgeting in his lap as they waited. "You okay?" Daniel asked, glancing at him. Tyler nodded, though he didn't look up. "Yeah, I didn't think this would ever happen." Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "It's happening." After what felt like an eternity, the clerk returned with the final paperwork. "Congratulations," she said with a warm smile, handing Daniel the documents. "You're officially Tyler's guardian." For a moment, Daniel just stared at the papers, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. He had spent his entire life focused on winning cases, climbing the ladder of success, and now, here he was, responsible for another person, someone who depended on him. It was terrifying, but it was also the most fulfilling thing he had ever experienced. When they left the courthouse, Tyler looked up at Daniel, his expression unreadable. "So, what now?" Daniel smiled, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Now we go home." The first few weeks of their new life together were an adjustment for both of them. Daniel had never lived with anyone, let alone a 12-year-old boy, and Tyler had never experienced a stable home life, at least not since his mother had passed. But despite the occasional awkwardness, they fell into a comfortable routine. Tyler was enrolled in school, and though he struggled at first, Daniel made sure he had all the support he needed. They spent weekends at the park, playing catch or watching baseball games, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was living for more than just his career. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day in court, Daniel came home to find Tyler sitting at the kitchen table, working on a homework assignment. "Hey," Tyler said, glancing up with a small smile. "How was work?" Daniel smiled back, setting his briefcase down. "Exhausting." "How about you? How's the homework going?" Tyler shrugged, his smile widening slightly. "It's math. It's boring." Daniel chuckled, sitting down across from him. "Well, I'm no math whiz, but I can try to help if you want." Tyler's eyes lit up with surprise. "Really? Really?" Daniel said, leaning over to take a look at the homework. "Let's see what we've got here." They worked together for the next hour, Daniel helping Tyler with his math problems, and in the process, realizing just how much his life had changed. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined sitting at a kitchen table helping a kid with homework. But now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. After they finished, Tyler looked up at Daniel with a rare, vulnerable expression. "Thanks," he said softly, "for, everything." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad you're here." Tyler smiled, and for the first time, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace, a peace he hadn't known he needed, but now couldn't imagine living without. Daniel's life had always been defined by achievement, winning cases, securing power, and gaining respect in the legal world. But as he sat at the kitchen table watching Tyler laugh while they played a game of cards after dinner, he realized that his definition of success had completely changed. Tyler had been living with Daniel for several months now, and in that time, their relationship had transformed. The once guarded boy who had distrusted the world around him was beginning to relax, to trust, to let his true self shine through. There were still moments of hesitation, times when Daniel could see the remnants of the hurt Tyler had experienced in his young life, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. For Daniel, the changes were profound. He had been so used to living in a bubble, focusing only on his career and keeping everyone at arm's length. But Tyler had forced him to open up, to care about someone in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had learned that success wasn't about winning cases or making money, it was about making a difference in the lives of the people you care about. And in Tyler's life, Daniel had found a sense of purpose that he hadn't known he was missing. After their card game, Daniel stood to clean up the dishes while Tyler lounged on the couch, flipping through the channels on TV. It was a simple evening, nothing extraordinary, but it felt right. There was peace in these small moments, a sense of normalcy that Daniel had never experienced before. As he rinsed the plates, Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his assistant, Julia. "Julia Walsh called?" "He wants to meet tomorrow morning," said it's important. Daniel's stomach tightened slightly. It had been a few months since he'd last spoken to Richard Walsh, Tyler's uncle. Though they had come to an understanding about Tyler's guardianship, There was still an unspoken tension between them. Richard had backed down, respecting Tyler's wishes to stay with Daniel, but Daniel couldn't help but wonder if that decision had fully settled in Richard's mind. Daniel texted Julia back, agreeing to the meeting. He glanced over at Tyler, who was now watching some baseball highlights on TV, completely unaware of the conversation happening behind the scenes. He didn't want to worry Tyler, but the truth was, he wasn't sure what Richard wanted. The next morning, Daniel made his way to the familiar offices of Walsh Industries, where Richard's empire was headquartered. The building was as imposing as ever, a sleek tower of glass and steel that reflected the power and influence Richard commanded in the business world. Daniel had been here many times before, but today, the weight of what might happen sat heavy on his shoulders. He was greeted by Richard's assistant and shown into the executive office, where Richard stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as Daniel entered, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Daniel," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Thanks for coming." Daniel sat down, his expression calm but wary. "Of course. What's this about?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. He looked older than Daniel remembered, as though the past few months had worn on him in ways that his usual confidence couldn't hide. "It's about Tyler," Richard said, sitting down as well. "I've been thinking about him a lot." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He kept his tone steady, but inside, a wave of protectiveness surged. "Hez doing well," Daniel said. "Hez happy. Hez adjusting to school. Hez settled." Richard nodded, but his face remained troubled. "I know, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for him. Truly I am." There was a pause, and Daniel felt the tension in the air thicken. "But he's my family," Richard continued, his voice quiet. "Hez my sister's son, and I can't help but feel that I've failed him, failed to give him the life she would have wanted for him." Daniel shifted in his seat. He knew what was coming, and the thought of it made his chest tighten. "Are you asking for him back?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Richard shook his head quickly, looking genuinely surprised by the question. No, I'm not asking that." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the tension didn't ease completely. "Then what do you want?" Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I want to be a part of his life. I know I haven't earned it. I know I've let him down. But I want to fix that. I want to be there for him, even if it's from a distance." Daniel's eyes softened. He hadn't expected this. He had prepared himself for a battle, for a fight to keep Tyler with him. But Richard wasn't here to take Tyler away. He was here to ask for something Daniel hadn't anticipated: forgiveness, and a chance to make things right. "I don't want to confuse him," Richard continued. "I don't want to disrupt the life you've given him. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to build a relationship with him." For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. He thought of Tyler, of how far he had come, of how much progress they had made. He thought of the boy's anger and mistrust toward his uncle, the wounds that had been left unhealed for so long. But then he thought of what Richard was saying now, of the genuine regret in his voice, the desire to do better. Tyler deserved the chance to have family, and maybe Richard deserved a second chance too. "I can't speak for Tyler," Daniel said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But if that's what he wants, then I think it's something we can talk about." Richard exhaled, a look of relief crossing his face. "Thank you, Daniel. I know this isn't easy for you." Daniel nodded, though his mind was still swirling with thoughts. "He'll talk to him, but it has to be on his terms." Later that evening, Daniel sat with Tyler in the living room, both of them watching the baseball game they had been looking forward to. Tyler was sprawled across the couch, his feet dangling off the edge, and Daniel sat in his usual spot by the armchair, half watching the game and half lost in thought. He hadn't told Tyler about the conversation with Richard yet. Part of him wasn't sure how to bring it up. Tyler had been doing so well lately. He was thriving in school, making friends, even getting back into baseball. The last thing Daniel wanted was to dredge up old wounds. But he couldn't avoid the conversation forever. Richard had made his request, and now it was up to Tyler to decide what he wanted. As the commercial break came on, Daniel turned to Tyler, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. Can we talk for a minute? Tyler glanced over at him, his brow furrowing slightly. About what? Daniel shifted in his seat. It's about your uncle. Immediately, Tyler's expression hardened, his body tensing. What about him? Daniel took a deep breath. I met with him today. He wanted to talk about you. Tyler sat up, his arms crossed over his chest. I don't care what he wants. I know, Daniel said gently. But you should hear this. He's not asking you to live with him. He's not trying to take you away. Tyler's arms loosened slightly, though his expression was still guarded. Then what does he want? He wants to be a part of your life, Daniel said. He wants to make things right. He knows he messed up before, but he's asking for a second chance? For a long moment, Tyler didn't say anything. His gaze dropped to the floor, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Daniel could see the conflict on his face, the mix of anger, hurt, and something else. Something like hope. I don't know, Tyler said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't care about me before. Why should I believe him now? Daniel's chest tightened at the vulnerability in Tyler's voice. I don't think it's about believing him right away, Daniel said softly. It's about giving him the chance to prove himself. And it's up to you, Tyler. No one's going to force you to do anything you don't want to. Tyler sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, his face a storm of emotions. Finally, he looked up at Daniel, his eyes filled with uncertainty. What do you think I should do? Tyler asked, his voice small. Daniel leaned forward, his voice gentle but honest. I think you should give him a chance. Not for his sake, but for yours. You deserve to have family, Tyler. And if there's even a small part of you that wants to know him better, I think it's worth trying. Tyler stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Daniel's face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe trust. Then slowly he nodded. Okay, Tyler said, his voice barely audible. I'll give him a chance. The first meeting between Tyler and Richard was awkward, to say the least. They had agreed to meet at a neutral place, a quiet park, on the outskirts of the city, where they could talk without any pressure. Daniel had brought Tyler, but he kept his distance, letting the two of them navigate this delicate reunion on their own terms. Tyler stood by the swings, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, while Richard approached with slow, cautious steps. The older man looked nervous, something Daniel hadn't seen in Richard before. He was always so composed, so sure of himself. But now, as he stood before his nephew, he looked almost fragile. Tyler, Richard said softly, his voice filled with hesitation. Tyler glanced at him, then looked away, kicking at the dirt beneath his feet. Hi. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Richard took another step forward, stopping a few feet away from Tyler. I'm glad you came, he said, his voice tentative. I know I've let you down, more than once, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm hoping we can start over. Tyler's jaw tightened, but he didn't walk away. He stood there, silent, listening, his body language stiff and uncomfortable. I've thought about your mom a lot, Richard continued, his voice growing heavier with emotion. She would have wanted us to be a family, and I failed her in that. I failed you. But I want to make it right. For the first time, Tyler turned to face his uncle, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. Why now, he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Why do you care now, when you didn't care before? Richard's face crumpled, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Because I didn't know how, he admitted, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to be there for you. And by the time I realized how much I had let you down, it felt like it was too late. Tyler swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground again. I don't know if I can trust you. I understand, Richard said softly, and I'm not asking you to trust me right away. But I'm asking you to let me try. There was a long, painful silence before Tyler finally nodded. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Over the next few months, Richard slowly became a part of Tyler's life. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, moments when Tyler's old wounds resurfaced, but they were making progress. Richard attended some of Tyler's baseball games. They went out for lunch a few times, and though their relationship was far from perfect, it was growing. Through it all, Daniel remained a steady presence in Tyler's life. He was still the one Tyler came home to, still the one who helped with homework, who played catch in the park, who made sure Tyler had everything he needed. And for Daniel, that was enough. He had never expected to be a father figure, but now that he was, it felt right. His career, once the most important thing in his life, had taken a back seat to something far more meaningful. He still worked, still won cases, but his heart wasn't in it the way it used to be. Now his heart was with Tyler. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Tyler turned to Daniel with a rare, quiet smile. "Thanks," Tyler said, his voice soft. "For what?" Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow. "For everything," Tyler replied. "For being here. For not giving up on me." Daniel's chest tightened with emotion. He had spent so many years focused on winning, on success, on being the best. But now, as he looked at Tyler, this boy who had come into his life and changed everything, he realized that true success wasn't about money or power. It was about love, connection, and making a difference in someone's life. And in that moment, Daniel knew that he had finally found the success he had been searching for all along. The years passed, and Daniel watched with pride as Tyler grew into a confident, capable young man. He excelled in school, became a star player on his baseball team, and formed friendships that would last a lifetime. He still had his moments of doubt, his moments of struggle, but with Daniel's guidance and Richard's support, he knew he had a family that would always be there for him. Daniel, too, had changed. He continued to work as a lawyer, but his focus had shifted. He took on more pro bono cases, helping families and children in need, using his skills to make a real difference in the world. And with Tyler by his side, he found a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything he had ever achieved in the courtroom. In the end, Daniel realized that the true measure of success wasn't in the cases he won or the money he made. It was in the lives he touched, the relationships he built, and the love he gave. And as he stood on the porch, watching Tyler and his friends play baseball in the yard, Daniel knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: a family. 5 years had passed since Daniel became Tyler's legal guardian. In those 5 years, both their lives had changed in ways they could never have predicted. Daniel, who had once lived for the thrill of winning high-stakes cases, now found his greatest joys in the smaller, quieter moments that involved Tyler and the life they had built together. It was the end of summer, and Daniel stood on the porch of their suburban home, watching as Tyler, now 17, practiced throwing a baseball with a couple of friends from his high school team. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard, and the sounds of laughter filled the air as the boys tossed the ball back and forth. As Daniel watched, he couldn't help but smile. Tyler had grown into a confident, well-adjusted young man. The shy, angry boy who had once stood at his office door looking for help was now a star pitcher on the high school baseball team, his natural talent nurtured over years of practice. More importantly, Tyler was happy, and that, to Daniel, was the greatest achievement of all. The back door opened, and Julia stepped out onto the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade. Julia had been by Daniel's side for years, and in the past few years, their relationship had deepened into something more meaningful. She had been a rock for Daniel during his transition to fatherhood, and slowly, over time, their professional relationship had blossomed into a romantic one. She handed him a glass, smiling as she watched the boys in the yard. "He's really come a long way," she said softly. Daniel nodded, a sense of pride welling up in his chest. "He has. I can't believe he's almost done with high school." "He's going to do great things," Julia said, her eyes full of warmth. "And he's lucky to have you." Daniel took a sip of his lemonade, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life he now had. He had spent so many years focused on himself, on his career, his goals, his success, but Tyler had changed all of that. Tyler had shown him what truly mattered. As they stood there together, watching Tyler with his friends, Daniel realized just how far they had all come. They had created something special, something Daniel had never thought he wanted, but now couldn't imagine living without. The next year passed in a whirlwind of activity. Tyler's senior year of high school was filled with all the usual milestones: prom, graduation, and a flurry of college applications. It was a busy time, but through it all, Daniel remained a steady presence, offering guidance and support as Tyler navigated the challenges of growing up. On the day of Tyler's graduation, the entire family gathered in the auditorium. Daniel, Julia, and even Richard, who had become a welcome part of Tyler's life. The tension between Daniel and Richard had long since eased, and though their relationship was still more professional than personal, they had come to an understanding. Richard, for his part, had worked hard to rebuild his connection with Tyler, and while their relationship wasn't perfect, it was strong enough to endure. As the ceremony began, Daniel sat in the audience, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Tyler walk across the stage to receive his diploma. He had come so far from a boy who had felt abandoned and unwanted to a young man who had worked hard to overcome the obstacles in his path. When the principal announced Tyler's name, the auditorium erupted into applause, and Daniel found himself standing alongside Julia and Richard, cheering for the boy they had all come to love. Tyler accepted his diploma with a wide grin, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Daniel. In that moment, their eyes met, and Daniel saw the gratitude and love reflected in Tyler's gaze. After the ceremony, they gathered outside in the sunshine, posing for pictures and sharing stories of the past few years. Tyler stood tall in his cap and gown, laughing with his friends and basking in the glow of his accomplishment. But when the crowd began to thin out, he made his way over to Daniel, who stood a little off to the side, watching proudly. "Thanks," Tyler said, his voice quiet but sincere. For what, Daniel asked, though he already knew. "For everything," Tyler replied. "For always being there. For not giving up on me." Daniel smiled, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Tyler. More than you'll ever know." Tyler's smile widened, and for a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. After graduation, Tyler decided to attend a local college, choosing to stay close to home while pursuing a degree in sports medicine. He had always loved baseball, but over time, he had developed an interest in the mechanics of the game, the science behind how athletes moved and trained. It was a career path that excited him, and Daniel was thrilled to see Tyler pursuing something he was passionate about. In the months that followed, their relationship continued to grow and evolve. Tyler was becoming more independent, and while Daniel sometimes missed the days when he was needed more, he was proud of the young man Tyler was becoming. There was still a bond between them that was unbreakable, built on years of trust, love, and shared experiences. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Tyler working on a college assignment, and Daniel reviewing legal documents, Tyler looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever miss it?" Tyler asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Daniel glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Miss what?" "Your old life," Tyler clarified. "You know, before me." Daniel set down his pen, considering the question. "I don't," he said honestly. "My life before you. It was empty. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was missing something important." Tyler nodded, his gaze dropping back to his textbook. "I guess I always thought I was the one who needed you. But maybe we needed each other." Daniel's chest tightened at the boy's words. It was true, he had spent so many years building walls around himself, avoiding emotional connections, but Tyler had forced him to break those walls down. In doing so, Daniel had found something far more meaningful than success or money. He had found a family. "You're right," Daniel said softly. "We did." Years later, on a warm summer day, Daniel found himself standing on the sidelines of a local baseball field, watching as Tyler, now an assistant coach for a youth baseball team, worked with a group of young players. Tyler had found his place in the world, combining his love for sports with his desire to help others, and Daniel couldn't have been prouder. As he watched Tyler move across the field, offering guidance and encouragement to the kids, Daniel realized just how far they had both come. The boy who had once been lost, angry, and alone was now a mentor to others, helping them find their way just as Daniel had helped him. Julia stood beside Daniel, her hand resting on his arm as they watched the game together. They had been married for 2 years now, and though their relationship had started in the professional realm, it had grown into something deep and enduring. Together, they had built a life that was full of love, laughter, and meaning. "You know," Julia said, her voice soft but teasing, "you've come a long way since those days in the office." Daniel chuckled, nodding. "Yeah, I have." He thought back to the man he used to be, the man who cared only about his career, who kept everyone at arm's length. That version of himself felt like a distant memory now, a shadow of the man he had become. As the game ended, Tyler jogged over to them, a wide grin on his face. "We won," he said, his voice full of excitement. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course you did." They gathered their things and headed to the car, laughing and chatting about the game. As they walked, Daniel felt a deep sense of contentment, a feeling that had eluded him for so long but was now ever present in his life. He had found what he had been searching for all along, not in the courtroom, not in power or success, but in the family he had built, the love he had given and received, and the difference he had made in the lives of those around him. And as they drove away, the sound of Tyler's laughter filling the car, Daniel knew that this was the life he had always wanted, even if he hadn't known it at the time. He had found his purpose. He had found his family. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey with Daniel and Tyler. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Daniel's transformation and Tyler's path to healing? Drop a comment below and let us know. Don't forget to like and share this story with friends who might enjoy it too. Together, we can spread more love and inspiration. But as people stopped to admire her paintings, offering compliments, and asking about her process, she felt a sense of validation she hadn't expected. One of the visitors to the exhibit was Professor Reynolds, the board member who had supported the changes at Brookwood. He paused in front of one of Chloe's paintings, studying it carefully. "This is remarkable," he said, turning to Chloe with a smile. "You have a real talent." Chloe blushed, feeling both proud and shy at the same time. "Thank you. It means a lot." As the evening went on, Chloe realized that she had found her place not just as a student at Brookwood, but as an artist with a voice of her own. The Carter family had been through a storm, but they had come out stronger on the other side. With the lawsuit behind them and Brookwood Academy on a new path, they were ready to focus on what mattered most to each other. One summer evening, the family gathered in their backyard for a barbecue, a tradition they had started before the chaos of the lawsuit had consumed their lives. The smell of grilled food filled the air as they laughed and talked, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. Jasmine and Chloe sat on the patio, reminiscing about their first day at Brookwood and how much had changed since then. "I never thought we'd get through all of that," Jasmine said, sipping lemonade. "But here we are." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad we didn't give up. It was hard, but we made it." Ethan joined them, holding a plate of burgers and hot dogs. He smiled at his daughters, pride radiating from him. "You two are the strongest people I know. You fought for what was right, and you made a difference." Vanessa, carrying a bowl of salad, sat down beside Ethan. She placed a hand on his arm, her expression filled with love and gratitude. "We all made a difference, and we did it together." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, the Carters sat around the table eating and laughing. The weight of the past year finally lifted. They knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. That night, as Jasmine and Chloe sat outside, looking up at the stars, they reflected on how far they had come. They had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of their place in the world. "I think we're going to be okay," Chloe said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we're going to be just fine." Months after the lawsuit had ended, the Carter family continued to move forward, both personally and professionally. Ethan's proposed bill on educational reform was gaining momentum in Congress, with support from lawmakers across the political spectrum. The bill aimed to establish nationwide guidelines for private school admissions, ensuring that no student would be discriminated against based on race, socioeconomic status, or background. On the day of the vote, Ethan stood in the Senate chamber, addressing his colleagues with the same passion that had driven him throughout the Brookwood case. "This bill is about fairness," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about giving every child a fair shot at success. It's about ensuring that no student is ever told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We've come a long way, but we still have work to do. And it starts here, with this bill." As the vote was cast, the bill passed with overwhelming support, marking a major victory in the fight for educational equity. Ethan, standing in the Senate chamber, allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The fight was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued to work on cases related to racial discrimination, using her platform to advocate for families facing similar challenges. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing her knowledge and experience to help them navigate the complexities of civil rights law. For Jasmine and Chloe, life at Brookwood had settled into a new normal. They continued to thrive academically, but they also made time for the things they loved: debating, painting, and building friendships with students from all walks of life. One afternoon, as the sisters sat in the school library, Chloe looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at Jasmine. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Chloe asked. Jasmine thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't like to think about that. What matters is that we did fight. And because of that, everything changed." Chloe nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We should be proud of that." "We are," Jasmine said, her voice filled with certainty. "We made a difference." As the sisters packed up their things and headed out of the library, they knew that their fight had been worth it. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, and they had helped pave the way for a future where every student, regardless of race or background, could walk through the doors of opportunity with their head held high. The road ahead was long, but the Carters were ready for it. Thank you so much for following the Carter family's journey to justice and equality. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about powerful narratives that challenge society, inspire change, and explore the human experience, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on new content. Together, we can continue to share stories that matter. See you in the next one. The police are on their way, Derek. You've lost. Derek's eyes darted around, realizing for the first time that the entire street was watching him. His bravado faltered, his shoulders tensing as he took in the growing crowd of neighbors, all standing together in a show of solidarity. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might lash out, might do something reckless. But then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His fists unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and with one last look at Edith filled with hatred and resentment, he turned and stormed back to his car. The street was silent as Derek sped away, his tires screeching against the pavement. Edith's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She stood there for a moment, frozen, until Bill crossed the street and stood beside her. "You okay, Edith?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Edith nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to all of you." Bill smiled warmly, giving her a reassuring nod. "We're not going to let him hurt you, Edith. Not now, not ever." Edith's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of gratitude. She had been afraid for so long, but now, standing here with her neighbors by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone. In the days following the final confrontation with Derek, the neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the sense of fear that had once gripped Cedar Street began to dissipate. Derek hadn't returned, and Edith had received word from the police that he was being closely monitored. They had issued a restraining order, preventing Derek from coming within a certain distance of Edith's home or the shelter where Rachel and the girls were staying. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give Edith peace of mind for now. Rachel called regularly, checking in to see how Edith was doing and updating her on their progress. The shelter had helped her find legal representation, and she was working towards securing full custody of the girls and filing for divorce from Derek. It was a long, difficult road, but Rachel was determined to keep moving forward. "The girls are adjusting," Rachel said during one phone call, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "They're starting to sleep better, and we're getting used to our new routine. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free." Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors' sons, strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith. Really, I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.